The town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, in the bitter winter of 1891, was a place where smoke from factory chimneys mingled with the cold Atlantic fog, creating a perpetual gray shroud over timber yards and tenement houses. It was a town built on the sweat of immigrants and the fortunes of a few prominent families, chief among them, the Holbrooks. Ezra Stone moved through its snow-covered streets like a ghost. For 23 years, he had not uttered a single word. At 51, Ezra possessed the compact, muscular build of a man who had spent his life working with his hands. His shoulders were broad, his forearms corded with muscle from decades of sawing and shaping wood. But it was his face that commanded attention, weathered like old oak, framed by a silver beard, and dominated by eyes the color of winter sea ice. Eyes that missed nothing, eyes that catalogued, assessed, remembered. Those eyes were watching now as Ezra stood at his workbench in the corner workshop of the Holbrook sawmill, apparently focused on the intricate molding he was carving for a Boston Keys mansion. Through the window, he observed the mill yard. Workers hunched against the February cold, their breath forming clouds. The foreman, Greg Turner, shouting orders, his face red with more than just the chill. And emerging from the office building, a young woman clutching a ledger to her chest, her dark hair escaping from beneath her woolen cap. Anna Kowalski, Polish, 23 years old. She'd been working in the mill office for 6 months, managing inventory and accounts. Ezra had been watching her with growing concern for the past 3 weeks. She walked quickly across the yard, her eyes darting toward the main building where Nathaniel Holbrook's private office occupied the 2nd floor. Even from this distance, Ezra could read the tension in her shoulders, the fear in her quick, furtive movements. He recognized that fear. He had felt it himself, 23 years ago, when he had tried to speak truth to power and learned that truth without power was merely noise to be drowned out. The screaming whine of the great saws cut through his thoughts. Ezra returned his attention to the wood before him, his hands moving with the precision of long practice, but his mind was elsewhere, traveling back to October 14th, 1868, the last day he had spoken. The Holbrook factory had been working double shifts that autumn, rushing to fill orders before winter. Ezra, then 28 and newly married, had been working as a Finnish carpenter in the furniture workshop. He'd noticed the locked doors, Silas Holbrook's new policy to prevent workers from leaving before shifts end. But like everyone else, he'd kept his concerns to himself. Jobs were scarce. Families needed feeding. He'd been in the tool room, sharpening chisels, when he heard the first screams. The fire started in the main production floor where cotton waste soaked in machine oil was stored too close to the boilers. Within minutes, flames engulfed the wooden building. Ezra ran toward the exits, joining the crush of panicked workers, and found them locked from the outside. Through the smoke, he saw Silas Holbrook and his son Nathaniel slip out through the manager's private entrance, a door the workers didn't have keys to. Ezra had smashed a window with a workbench, cutting his palm to the bone in the process. He and 6 others escaped. 17 men died, clawing at locked doors while the building burned around them. At the inquest, Ezra testified. He spoke clearly, precisely, about the locked doors, about watching the Holbrooks leave through their private exit without unlocking the workers' doors. He brought the scar on his palm as evidence, described the exact sequence of events, named the dead men he'd known for years. Silas Holbrook's lawyers destroyed him. Expert witnesses testified that Ezra, traumatized by grief, his own brother had died in the fire, was confused, mistaken, perhaps even delusional. Other workers who'd been prepared to support his testimony suddenly recanted or disappeared. The newspapers questioned his character, his stability, his motives. The coroner's jury ruled it accidental death. No charges filed, no compensation beyond burial costs. Ezra stood in the back of that courthouse, listened to the verdict, and felt something crystallize inside him. Not despair, clarity. Words meant nothing in a world where power determined truth. So he would give them no more words. but he would give them something else. Witness. Silent, patient, relentless witness. He walked home that evening and spoke one final sentence to his wife. Mary, I will not speak again until truth matters more than power. Then he sealed his lips. Mary, who understood him better than anyone, simply nodded and fetched him a journal and pencil. A sharp knock on the workshop door pulled Ezra back to the present. Greg Turner stood in the doorway, his bulk blocking the winter light. Holbrook wants to see you, Turner said, his voice carrying its usual edge of contempt. Now. Ezra set down his chisel, wiped his hands on his apron, and nodded. He followed Turner across the yard, their boots crunching on packed snow, toward the main office building. Nathaniel Holbrook's office occupied the entire second floor, a monument to industrial wealth. Persian rugs, mahogany furniture, a massive desk positioned to overlook the mill complex like a general surveying his troops. Holbrook himself stood by the window, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. At 45, he had his father's build, tall, broad-shouldered. But where Silas had been crude and direct, Nathaniel possessed a veneer of refinement, tailored suits from Boston, a precisely trimmed beard, gold cufflinks that caught the light. He turned as Ezra entered, his expression unreadable. Stone, he said, gesturing to a chair. Sit. Ezra remained standing. Holbrook's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of irritation. As you wish. He moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew a rolled set of architectural plans. I'm building a new house on Beacon Hill. The architect insists on custom millwork throughout. Wainscoting, coffered ceilings, a grand staircase. He recommended 3 master carpenters. Your name was first on his list. He unrolled the plans on his desk, weighing the corners with crystal paperweights. 6 months' work, maybe 8. I'll pay double your current rate, plus expenses for you to work on site in Boston. Holbrook's eyes met Ezra's. You'd leave next week. Ezra studied the plans. They were extraordinary, the kind of work a craftsman dreamed of. Intricate, challenging, prestigious. And 6 months in Boston meant 6 months away from Millbrook, away from the mill, away from whatever was developing between Anna Kowalski's investigations and Nathaniel Holbrook's secrets. He looked up from the plans directly into Holbrook's eyes and shook his head once, firmly. Double the rate isn't enough. Holbrook's voice sharpened. Triple then. Name your price, Stone. Ezra pulled a small notebook from his pocket, he always carried one for communication, and wrote quickly, I have commitments here. Holbrook read it, and something flickered across his face. Not anger, but something colder. Calculation. Commitments, he repeated softly. To what? You live alone. You have no family. Your only commitment is to this mill, and I'm offering you the opportunity of a lifetime. He paused. Unless your commitment is to other matters. The air in the room shifted, became charged with unspoken meaning. Ezra held Holbrook's gaze and wrote again. The work you describe will require my full attention. I cannot give that now. Cannot, Holbrook said, or will not. Before Ezra could respond, rapid footsteps sounded on the stairs. The door burst open, and Anna Kowalski stood in the doorway, her face flushed, her breathing quick. She held a ledger in her hands. Mr. Holbrook, I need to speak with you about... She stopped, seeing Ezra. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were... Miss Kowalski. Holbrook's voice was ice-wrapped in silk. I'm in a meeting. Whatever this is, it can wait. No, sir, it cannot. Her accent thickened with emotion. Fear or anger, Ezra couldn't tell which. There are discrepancies in the accounts, significant discrepancies. Money that should be in the payroll fund is... I said it can wait. Holbrook moved toward her with deliberate slowness. You're overwrought, Miss Kowalski. The numbers are complex. Perhaps you've made an error in your calculations. I've checked 3 times, sir. The error is not mine. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then we will discuss it tomorrow, Holbrook said. during normal business hours, in the presence of our accountant. Now, I suggest you return to your duties before you say something you'll regret." Anna's knuckles went white on the ledger. For a moment, Ezra thought she would push further, would speak the accusations clearly forming behind her eyes. Instead, she glanced at Ezra, a quick, desperate look that said, "Help me," then turned and fled down the stairs. Holbrook stood motionless, listening to her footsteps fade. Then he turned back to Ezra, and his expression was no longer cold. It was arctic. "You're dismissed, Stone. Think about my offer. You have until tomorrow to reconsider." Ezra descended the stairs slowly, his mind racing. In the mill yard, he saw Anna hurrying toward the gate, the ledger still clutched to her chest. Turner was watching her too, his expression thoughtful in a way that made Ezra's stomach tighten. That evening, Ezra didn't go straight home. Instead, he walked to the small Polish neighborhood on the south side of town, where Anna Kowalski boarded with her aunt and uncle. He stood across the street in the gathering darkness, watching the warm glow of lamplight in the windows, and waited. Anna emerged just after sunset, wrapped in a heavy shawl, walking quickly toward the center of town. Ezra followed at a distance. She went to the offices of the Millbrook Gazette, the town's weekly newspaper. Through the window, Ezra saw her speaking with the editor, Thomas Brennan, gesturing emphatically, showing him papers from the ledger. Brennan listened, nodded, made notes. The conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When Anna left, she looked lighter, as if she'd set down a heavy burden. Ezra knew better. She'd just signed her own death warrant. He followed her home, ensuring she arrived safely, then returned to his own house. In his workshop, he lit a lamp and retrieved the loose floorboard beneath his bed. From the cavity beneath, he withdrew his journals. 7 volumes now, spanning 23 years. He opened the most recent one and began to write, his hand steady despite the certainty settling in his chest like ice. February 15th, 1891. Anna Kowalski has discovered Nathaniel Holbrook's embezzlement. She has taken evidence to the Gazette. Holbrook knows. Turner knows. By this time tomorrow, I believe she will be dead, and it will be ruled an accident. I have carried my silence for 23 years, waiting for a moment when my voice might matter. That moment is approaching. I feel it like a storm on the horizon. I pray I am wrong about tomorrow. But I have been watching the Holbrooks for too long to be wrong about this. He set down his pen and stared at the words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying the scent of snow. Somewhere in the darkness, the machinery of injustice was grinding into motion, and Ezra Stone, the silent witness, could only watch and wait, and prepare for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. That moment came sooner than he expected. At 11:30 that night, Ezra sat on his porch despite the cold, unable to sleep. In the distance, toward the mill, he saw a faint orange glow. As he watched, it grew brighter, angrier, painting the low clouds with reflected light. Fire. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, running through the snow-covered streets toward the mill. By the time he arrived, flames were already consuming the office building. The same building where Anna Kowalski worked, where the ledgers were kept, where the evidence of Holbrook's crimes was stored. A crowd gathered, faces lit by the blaze. Ezra pushed through them, his eyes scanning frantically. "Someone's still inside," a voice shouted. "I saw a light in the office window just before the fire started." Ezra's blood turned to ice. He looked toward the building's entrance, saw Greg Turner standing there, blocking the door, his face impassive as he watched the flames. "Can't go in," Turner was saying to the volunteer fire brigade. "Too dangerous. Building's going to collapse any minute." Ezra shoved past him, heading for the door. Turner grabbed his arm. "Are you mad, Stone? You'll die in there!" Ezra wrenched free and plunged into the smoke. The heat hit him like a physical blow. Flames crawled up the walls, consuming wood and paper with a roar that brought back every nightmare from 1868. The stairs to the second floor were already burning. But Ezra charged up them anyway, his boots smoking, his lungs screaming for air. The office door was locked. Through the smoke, Ezra saw a figure slumped against the far wall. Anna Kowalski, unconscious or worse, blood on her temple. The window behind her showed flames reflected in the glass. Ezra threw his shoulder against the door. Once, twice. The lock splintered and he burst through, crossing the burning room in 3 strides. He lifted Anna's limp form, she was lighter than he expected, and turned back toward the door. The staircase collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. Ezra pivoted toward the window. No time for hesitation. He wrapped Anna in his coat, covered her head with his arms, and drove his shoulder through the glass. They fell through smoke and flame, tumbling into the snowdrift 2 stories below. Hands grabbed them, pulled them away from the burning building. Someone was shouting for a doctor. Anna lay in the snow, her face pale, but her chest rising and falling. Alive. Ezra knelt beside her, his own hands blistered and bleeding, and allowed himself one moment of relief before he looked up and met Nathaniel Holbrook's eyes across the crowd. Holbrook stood apart from the others, his expression unreadable in the firelight. But Ezra saw the calculation there, the cold assessment. This was not over. This was barely beginning. As the fire brigade fought the blaze, as Anna was carried to the doctor's office, as the crowd dispersed into the freezing night, Ezra walked home through the snow, his mind absolutely clear. He had saved her tonight. But tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, Holbrook would try again. Men like Holbrook always did. They had power, money, influence. They could make accidents happen. They could make people disappear. They could rewrite truth itself, unless someone stopped them. In his workshop, Ezra opened his journal one more time and wrote, "The silence ends soon. Not because I wish it, but because it must. Anna Kowalski lives, but she will not stay alive unless the truth comes to light. And the truth has been silent for 23 years too long. Tomorrow I begin preparing my testimony, not for a coroner's jury that can be bought, not for a sheriff who looks the other way, but for a reckoning that cannot be ignored. I have watched, I have remembered, I have documented. Now I will speak." He closed the journal, extinguished the lamp, and sat in darkness, listening to the winter wind howl around his house, knowing that the storm he'd been waiting for had finally arrived. Dr. Isaiah Pemberton's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building on Main Street, its windows perpetually fogged with steam from the medicinal kettles that bubbled on his stove. When Ezra arrived at dawn, the sky barely lightening to charcoal gray, he found the doctor slumped in a chair beside his examination table, exhausted from a night of tending burns and smoke inhalation. Anna Kowalski lay on the table, unconscious but breathing steadily. A white bandage wrapped her head where something, or someone, had struck her before the fire. Her hands, resting on the blanket covering her, were blistered but not severely burned. Pemberton looked up as Ezra entered, his weathered face creased with concern and something else. Fear. "Stone," he said quietly, glancing toward the door as if expecting to be overheard. "She'll live. Concussion, smoke inhalation, minor burns. She's young, strong. Give her a few days." He paused, lowering his voice further. "But the injury to her head, that didn't come from the fire. Someone hit her, hard, before the blaze started." Ezra pulled out his notebook. "Who knows this?" "Just us," Pemberton said. "And I'd prefer to keep it that way until we understand what's happening. The official story is already circulating. Anna stayed late working, knocked over a lamp, started the fire, and got trapped. An accident." His eyes met Ezra's. "But we both know better, don't we?" Ezra studied Anna's pale face, the purple bruise darkening her temple. 23 years ago, 17 men had died in an accident. The pattern was repeating itself, but this time he'd intervened. This time there was a living witness. "Can she be moved?" he wrote. "Not safely, not yet. Why?" When she wakes, she'll be in danger. Here, she's exposed. Pemberton rubbed his face with both hands. What are you suggesting, Stone? That I harbor a fugitive in my practice? That someone— He couldn't bring himself to name Nathaniel Holbrook directly— would harm an unconscious woman under a doctor's care? Ezra simply held his gaze, and Pemberton's shoulders sagged with the weight of understanding. My God, the doctor whispered. It's happening again, isn't it? Like 1868. Like your brother and those other men. He stood abruptly, moved to his window, and stared out at the street. I was younger then. Just started my practice. I examined the bodies after the fire. I knew. Those men had died trying to break through locked doors. Their hands were shredded, their fingernails torn off, clawing at wood and metal. His voice cracked. And I said nothing. I signed the certificates. Death by misadventure. I told myself I had no proof, that accusations without evidence would ruin me, that my patients needed me alive and practicing, not destroyed by the Holbrooks. He turned back to Ezra. I've carried that silence for 23 years, Stone. Every day, it's grown heavier. And now— He gestured toward Anna. Now I have a second chance to do what I should have done then. Ezra wrote quickly. This time, there will be proof. This time, people will listen. But she needs to survive long enough to testify. What do you need from me? Keep her here. Tell no one she's awake when she wakes. If Holbrook or Turner asks, say she's delirious, unable to speak coherently. Buy me 3 days. 3 days for what? Ezra closed his notebook without answering. Some things were better left unwritten until the moment arrived. The ruins of the office building still smoldered as Ezra walked through the mill yard that morning. Volunteer firefighters picked through the debris, salvaging what little remained. The acrid smell of wet, burned wood hung heavy in the cold air. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell stood near the collapsed structure, making notes in a small book, a performative gesture Ezra knew, since Caldwell had been in Holbrook's pocket for as long as anyone could remember. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, his star pinned to a coat straining at its buttons, his face perpetually flushed from drink. Nathaniel Holbrook stood beside him, playing his role perfectly. The concerned employer, surveying the damage to his property, asking questions about the investigation. He wore a heavy wool coat and leather gloves, looking every inch the prosperous industrialist, troubled by this unfortunate incident. He saw Ezra and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A brief hardening around the eyes, quickly masked. "Ah, Stone," he called out. "Heroic work last night. You saved Miss Kowalski's life." He approached, extending his hand. Ezra looked at the offered hand but didn't take it. Instead, he pulled out his notebook. How did the fire start? Holbrook withdrew his hand smoothly, as if the rebuff hadn't occurred. Sheriff Caldwell is investigating, but it appears Miss Kowalski was working late, against my explicit instructions, I might add, and accidentally knocked over a lamp. The office was filled with papers, ledgers, all highly flammable. The fire spread quickly. Why was she working late? I couldn't say. Perhaps she was behind in her duties. Holbrook's voice carried just the right note of regret. A tragic accident, but thankfully not a fatal one. Thanks to you. Sheriff Caldwell lumbered over, wheezing slightly from the exertion. Mr. Stone? He nodded. Mighty brave, what you did. Mighty foolish, too, if you don't mind my saying. Could have gotten yourself killed. Ezra wrote, I saw someone near the building before the fire started. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Someone? Who? I couldn't identify them in the darkness, but they were moving away from the building quickly, just before I saw the first flames. It was a lie, but a strategic one. Ezra had seen no such person, but the lie served a purpose. It planted a seed of doubt in the official narrative, created a question that would need answering. Caldwell glanced at Holbrook, who remained perfectly composed. Well now, that's interesting. You're sure about this, Stone? You saw someone? Ezra nodded firmly. But you can't identify them, can't say if it was a man or woman, can't describe what they were wearing. Another nod. Caldwell closed his notebook with a snap. Then I don't see how that helps us much, does it? Could have been anyone. Could have been a passerby who saw the fire starting and ran to get help. Could have been a trick of the shadows. He turned to Holbrook. I'll file my report this afternoon, sir. Accidental fire, 1 injury, no fatalities. Lucky all around. Indeed, Holbrook said. Though the loss of records will set us back considerably. Years of accounts, contracts, correspondence, all gone. He sighed heavily. We'll have to reconstruct everything from memory and auxiliary records. A tremendous undertaking. How convenient, Ezra thought. The evidence of embezzlement Anna had discovered. The ledgers she'd been examining. The proof she'd taken to the newspaper, all conveniently destroyed. And if Anna's memory was conveniently impaired by her head injury, there would be nothing left but Holbrook's word against unsubstantiated accusations. Unless someone had made copies, unless someone had been documenting everything all along. Ezra wrote one more line. I'd like to help reconstruct the payroll records. I remember many details. Holbrook's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. That's generous, Stone, but unnecessary. I have copies of the most important documents in my personal safe. We'll manage. He paused. Though I notice you still haven't given me an answer about the Boston Commission. The offer remains open. In fact, given this setback, it might be good for both of us if you took it. Fresh start, new project, away from all this unpleasantness. I've made my decision. I'm staying. Pity, Holbrook said softly. I think you'd have enjoyed the work. He turned to leave, then stopped. Oh, and Stone, do give Miss Kowalski my best wishes for a speedy recovery when you visit her. I understand you've been to see her already this morning. Quite the devoted colleague. The implication was clear. I know where she is. I know you're protecting her. And I know where to find her when I need to. Ezra held Holbrook's gaze until the man turned and walked away, Caldwell trailing behind him like an obedient hound. The offices of the Millbrook Gazette occupied a cramped second-floor room above the hardware store on Main Street. Thomas Brennan, the editor, was a thin, nervous man in his 40s with ink-stained fingers and a tendency to jump at sudden noises. He'd run the paper for 15 years, carefully navigating the treacherous waters between truth and survival in a town dominated by the Holbrooks. When Ezra climbed the narrow stairs and entered the office, Brennan looked up from his typewriter with the expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news and was now receiving it. Mr. Stone, he said, his voice tight. I heard about your heroics last night. Remarkable. He didn't sound happy about it. Ezra wrote, Anna Kowalski came to see you yesterday. What did she tell you? Brennan's face went pale. I don't. That is, I'm not sure I should. He stopped, seeing something in Ezra's expression that made him reconsider his evasions. She showed me discrepancies in the mill's accounts, evidence of systematic embezzlement, thousands of dollars over several years, maybe tens of thousands, money skimmed from payroll, inflated supply costs, phantom expenses. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them nervously. She wanted me to publish an investigation. And will you? Brennan set his spectacles down on his desk and looked at his ink-stained hands. Mr. Stone, I'm a newspaper editor in a small town. The Holbrook Mill is the largest advertiser in my paper. Nathaniel Holbrook is on the Board of Selectmen, the church vestry, the Chamber of Commerce. His family has owned half this town for 3 generations. He met Ezra's eyes. If I publish accusations of embezzlement without ironclad proof, he'll destroy me. He'll pull his advertising, he'll sue for libel, he'll ensure no one in this town speaks to me or buys my paper. I have a wife, 3 children, a mortgage. Ezra wrote furiously. So you'll let him get away with theft? Let him try to murder Anna to cover his crimes? Murder? Brennan's voice rose. The fire was an accident. Sheriff Caldwell... Ezra slammed his hand on the desk, making the typewriter jump. He wrote in large, angry letters. I pulled her from that building. Someone had struck her head before the fire started. It was attempted murder. Brennan stared at the words, his face gray. My God, are you certain? Dr. Pemberton will confirm it. But he won't testify publicly unless others do first. No one wants to be the only voice speaking truth against Holbrook. Everyone's waiting for someone else to go first. And you think that someone should be me? You're a newspaper editor. Truth is supposed to be your profession. Brennan laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Truth? Mr. Stone, I publish the truth about church socials and harvest festivals and who won the blue ribbon at the county fair. That's the truth people want to read. He stood, moved to his window, and looked down at the street below. Do you know what happened to the last editor who challenged the Holbrooks? Before my time, but I heard the stories. Man named Richardson, back in the 70s, wrote a series about unsafe working conditions at the mill. 3 weeks after publication, his office burned down, middle of the night, no witnesses, ruled accidental. Richardson rebuilt, kept publishing. Then someone broke both his hands with a hammer. He left town, never came back. Brennan turned to face Ezra. I have 3 children, Stone. The oldest is 12. How do I look them in the eye and tell them Daddy has to write about truth, even if it means we lose everything? Ezra understood. He'd heard variations of this same speech from a dozen people over the years. The workers who wouldn't testify about unsafe conditions, the merchants who wouldn't refuse Holbrook's business, the churchgoers who wouldn't speak out against obvious injustice. Fear was a prison more secure than iron bars. He wrote, "What if you had proof that couldn't be denied? What if others were willing to speak with you? What if this time Holbrook couldn't make it go away? Do you have such proof?" Ezra paused, his pencil hovering over paper. Then he wrote, "Give me 3 days." 3 days, Brennan repeated. "And then what?" "Then I'll give you a story that will change everything." That evening, Ezra didn't go home. Instead, he returned to the mill yard after the workers had left, after the machines had gone silent, after Greg Turner had locked the gates and departed for his lodgings above the tavern on Water Street. The moon was a silver crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by. Ezra moved through the shadows with the practiced ease of a man who'd worked here for decades, who knew every building, every alley between the lumber stacks, every loose board and creaking hinge. Nathaniel Holbrook's office had escaped the fire. It was in a separate wing of the main building. But Ezra wasn't interested in the office. He was interested in what lay beneath it. The mill complex had been built in stages over 60 years. The oldest section, dating to the 1820s, included a stone foundation with a cellar that had once served as secure storage for valuable hardwoods. It was rarely used now. Most storage happened in the open-air yards or the newer warehouses. But Ezra knew that Holbrook used the old cellar for one specific purpose: safekeeping documents too sensitive or incriminating to store in his office safe. The cellar entrance was concealed behind a false panel in the main building's ground floor. Ezra had discovered it years ago while repairing floor joists. He'd watched Holbrook use it several times since, always late at night, always alone, always carrying a leather document case. It took Ezra 15 minutes to jimmy the panel open. The hinges, despite being oiled regularly, still squeaked faintly as he swung it aside. A narrow stone staircase descended into darkness. He lit the small oil lamp he'd brought, keeping the flame low, and descended. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, perhaps 20 feet square, with walls of mortared fieldstone that wept moisture. Wooden shelving lined 3 walls, holding boxes and crates carefully labeled and organized. Ezra began his search methodically, opening boxes, examining contents, looking for anything related to the mill's finances. He found it in the 4th box he opened, a separate set of ledgers, meticulously maintained, showing the actual accounts of the Holbrook mill operations. Next to them, for comparison, were copies of the official ledgers, the ones submitted to tax authorities and shown to investors. The discrepancies were staggering. Over 7 years, Nathaniel Holbrook had embezzled nearly $40,000, a fortune that would take an average worker several lifetimes to earn. The money had been systematically diverted through exactly the methods Anna had discovered: inflated supply costs, phantom employees on the payroll, underreported sales. But it was what Ezra found in the next box that made his blood run cold. Insurance policies on the factory building that had burned in 1868, and correspondence between Silas Holbrook and his lawyer, dated 2 weeks before the fire, discussing the building's deteriorating condition, the cost of necessary repairs versus the payout from a total loss claim. The fire might be the most economically prudent solution, Silas had written. The building is insured for far more than its actual value. A complete loss would allow us to rebuild with modern facilities while generating substantial capital. There was no explicit conspiracy to commit arson, but the implication was clear. The locked doors, the stored flammable materials, the convenient timing. It hadn't been negligence. It had been calculated profit. 17 men had died so Silas Holbrook could collect insurance money. Ezra's hands shook as he held the letter. For 23 years, he'd believed the fire was criminal negligence. Terrible, but not premeditated murder. Now he knew it was worse. Those men had been sacrificed like pawns on a chessboard, their lives worth less than the money their deaths would generate. He heard footsteps on the floor above. Ezra extinguished his lamp instantly, plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. The footsteps were heavy, purposeful, moving directly toward the concealed entrance. Light spilled down the staircase as the panel opened. "I know you're down there, Stone." Greg Turner's voice echoed off stone walls. "Saw your shadow in the window. Figured you'd turn to burglary eventually." Ezra remained perfectly still, pressed against the shelving in the darkest corner of the cellar. Turner descended the stairs, carrying a lantern in one hand and a heavy cudgel in the other. "Mr. Holbrook thought you might try something like this. That's why he asked me to keep watch tonight." He reached the bottom of the stairs and raised the lantern, its light pushing back the shadows. "Come out, Stone. No point hiding. Only one way out of this cellar, and I'm standing in it." Ezra could rush him. Turner was larger but slower, and surprise might give him an advantage. But even if he escaped, Turner would know he'd been here, would know what he'd seen, and Ezra would lose any element of surprise he might have had. Instead, he did something unexpected. He stepped out of the shadows, into the lamplight, and held up his hands in surrender. Turner grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Smart choice, old man. Now, let's see what you were looking—" Ezra threw a handful of cellar dirt directly into Turner's face. The foreman staggered back, clawing at his eyes, and Ezra moved. Not toward the stairs. Turner still blocked them. But toward the shelving. He grabbed the nearest box of documents and hurled it at Turner's lantern. Glass shattered, oil sprayed, and flames erupted across the stone floor. In the sudden chaos of light and fire, Ezra dove past Turner, taking a glancing blow from the cudgel that sent him sprawling on the stairs. He scrambled upward on hands and knees as Turner roared behind him, his hands finally clearing his eyes enough to see. Ezra burst through the panel and into the main building. He could hear Turner thundering up the stairs behind him. No time for subtlety. He ran for the main entrance, his boots echoing on wooden floors, and burst out into the night air. Behind him, Turner emerged from the building, his face contorted with rage. "Stop!" he bellowed. "Thief! Someone stop that man!" But the mill yard was deserted, the streets empty. Ezra ran through shadows he knew intimately, cutting through alleys, vaulting fences, until Turner's shouts faded behind him. He didn't go home. Too obvious. Instead, he made his way to the one place no one would think to look for him, the burned ruins of the office building. Crouching in the shadows of the collapsed structure, his heart hammering, his shoulder throbbing where Turner's cudgel had connected, Ezra took stock of the situation. He'd escaped, but empty-handed. The documents were still in the cellar. And now Turner knew he'd been there, knew he was actively investigating. The timetable had just accelerated. Whatever he was planning to do in 3 days would have to happen sooner. He pulled out his notebook, but his hands were shaking too badly to write. So he simply sat in the darkness, surrounded by the ashes of the previous night's attempted murder, and thought. For 23 years, he'd been the silent witness, content to watch and record and wait. But waiting was a luxury he no longer possessed. Anna Kowalski was in danger. The evidence was locked in Holbrook's cellar, and Ezra Stone was running out of time. The next morning, he would have to make a choice he'd avoided for more than 2 decades. He would have to trust someone. He would have to break his perfect protective silence, not all at once, not yet, but enough to set in motion events he could no longer control alone. The question was, who could he trust in a town where everyone had learned that silence was survival? As he sat in the cold darkness, watching the stars wheel overhead, he thought of Dr. Pemberton's confession about the guilt he'd carried for 23 years. He thought of Thomas Brennan's fear for his children. He thought of Anna Kowalski's courage in speaking up despite the risks. And he thought of his own silence, not the silence imposed by trauma, but the silence he'd chosen as protest, as preservation, as protection. Had it been wisdom or cowardice? Had he been bearing witness or simply hiding? He didn't have answers, but he knew this. Silence had kept him safe, but it had changed nothing. Holbrook still stole. Workers still suffered. And now a young woman had nearly died for trying to speak truth. Tomorrow, Ezra decided, he would begin breaking his silence. Not with words, not yet, but with action. He would find allies, he would gather proof, and he would build a case so overwhelming that even in Millbrook, Massachusetts, in the year 1891, truth might finally matter more than power. The stars faded as dawn approached, and Ezra Stone, the silent witness, rose from the ashes and walked toward an uncertain future, carrying with him the weight of 23 years of unspoken truth and the terrible knowledge that speaking it might cost him everything. But some truths, he had finally learned, were worth the cost.